A low, venomous hiss filled the room. "They'll never break me." Agatha spat, her eyes fixed on Luggard, the betrayal simmering in her words. "You think you're better than me?" She jerked her head toward Evelyn, voice laced with scorn. "Turning on family to save yourself, just like her. You're no different, Luggard." Her gaze burned, daring him to defy the blood they shared. "Here's an interesting tale. Go nowhere and watch till the end." Welcome to our channel, where we bring stories that captivate, inspire, and linger in the heart. If you're looking for tales with suspense, raw emotion, and unforgettable twists, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, like and share this video, and let's journey together. Now, let's begin. Agatha tightened her grip on the wheel, her eyes narrowed as she glared at the empty highway stretching endlessly ahead. She'd been in this business long enough to know every red flag and warning sign. But today, her instincts hummed with a strange excitement. The man she was about to meet, known only as L, was not a typical buyer. He was elusive, unpredictable, and untraceable, which meant he could also be useful, especially given the scale he proposed. He promised her profits unlike anything her late husband had ever dreamed of, and as much as Agatha missed her husband's influence, she relished the idea of taking his empire to new heights on her own terms. Her SUV, a sleek, powerful machine modified to handle any situation, hummed beneath her, blending power with luxury in a way that seemed to echo her own character. As she approached mile marker 56, her contact's designated rendezvous point, she checked the dashboard for any alerts. All systems were clear, as expected, until suddenly her vehicle lurched and groaned, the front tire scraping and screeching with a dull thud. "Damn it," she hissed, pressing her nails into the leather steering wheel. She forced herself to stay calm, scanning the road in her rearview mirror. There wasn't a soul around. No cars, no lights, nothing but the vast, oppressive silence of the highway. She was alone, or so it seemed. Stepping out, she noted the line of nails spread across the road, neatly positioned for someone just like her. Cursing whoever had laid the trap, she bent down to inspect the damage, her eyes quickly calculating the repair time. Agatha didn't scare easily, but a tingling sense of discomfort crept into her spine. She was rarely caught off guard, and she certainly didn't take well to being stranded. As she straightened up, she noticed a figure in the distance, emerging slowly but purposefully from behind the haze of the highway. He was tall, his posture calm, and though she could barely make out his features, his presence was unnervingly composed. She tensed, mentally running through the options of fight or flight, but soon she realized she was more curious than alarmed. The man drew closer, his stride smooth and confident, his dark skin and piercing gaze catching her attention. He moved with a quiet authority that unsettled her, but Agatha kept her face composed. The last thing she needed was to show fear or weakness, especially to someone who looked as if he knew exactly who she was. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice low and even, revealing no trace of emotion. "Just a bit of bad luck," she replied, masking her frustration with a practiced smile. She tilted her head, sizing him up. He looked as though he'd seen more than his fair share of trouble, yet bore no signs of haste or panic. He seemed prepared. "Well, that's what I'm here for," he said, bending down to inspect the tire. She noticed how his eyes briefly flickered over the nails scattered on the road. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his hands already working with precision to change the tire, as if it was a routine task. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Agatha observed him, noting his calm demeanor and unhurried pace, as though he had all the time in the world. It was rare for her to encounter someone with such patience, especially in her line of work. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of man he was, and whether he was trustworthy. "I don't recall seeing any cars out here," she said lightly, trying to gauge his intentions. "What brings you to this deserted highway?" "I had a feeling I'd find someone in need of help," he replied, not bothering to look up. His tone was casual, but there was an underlying sharpness to it, as if he were testing her reaction. Agatha's smile faltered, just for a moment. "A knight in shining armor, are you?" He finished tightening the last bolt and straightened up, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes held a glint of something that made her feel strangely exposed. "Not quite," he said with a small, cryptic smile. "But I have a knack for being where I need to be." Agatha's heartbeat quickened, her mind racing through the implications. There was something unsettlingly familiar about this man. Agatha watched the man work with a steady hand and an unreadable expression, her carefully crafted mask of charm in place. She offered him a polite smile, her demeanor warm yet guarded, hiding the annoyance simmering just beneath her skin. She was meant to be meeting a highly anticipated contact today, not getting waylaid on an empty stretch of road with a flat tire and a stranger who seemed too calm for her liking. The man, who hadn't yet offered his name, had a quiet confidence, and his silence only added to her growing sense of unease. He worked on her tire with ease, his movements deliberate and efficient. Agatha studied him carefully, casually leaning against the hood of her SUV. She wasn't one to trust strangers, but in this case, she had no choice. She didn't want to risk looking too guarded, too cautious. And so, she let him continue, all the while her mind whirring with questions. "Funny place for a tire to go out," she remarked, trying to keep her tone light. She wanted to see if he would give anything away. "Funny indeed," he replied, glancing up briefly with a small, knowing smile that unsettled her. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any further explanations, and Agatha found herself annoyed by his confidence, a confidence that seemed almost directed at her. She didn't like being on the back foot, but she kept her expression neutral, meeting his gaze with a pleasant smile that hinted at nothing. "Seems like you don't mind helping strangers in the middle of nowhere," she continued, hoping to draw him out a bit. "Sometimes strangers aren't so strange," he replied, his words laced with an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite place. He knelt by the wheel, his gaze focused but occasionally drifting to her, as if measuring her reaction. She kept her composure, offering a soft chuckle. "Is that so?" she asked, feeling the stirrings of suspicion despite herself. "And here I thought you were just passing by." "Passing by," he repeated, his tone neutral but with a hint of amusement. "Sure, we'll go with that." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew something. She could feel it. But her instinct told her to hold back, to pretend as if his words meant nothing. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the hood of the SUV as she watched him work, the silence between them growing heavy with unspoken words. She found herself considering the weight of her options, her mind flickering to her concealed weapon. If this stranger became too much of a liability, she knew exactly how to deal with him. Meanwhile, Luggard kept his face calm and expressionless as he worked. Inside, though, he felt the weight of his mission pressing down on him. Months of tracking her every move, every transaction, every shadowy connection had brought him to this moment. She didn't know it yet, but he was here for her. And only her. Agatha believed him to be a wealthy bidder, an interested buyer with deep pockets and even deeper connections. She had no idea that he was the ghost who'd been haunting her digital trail for months, piecing together the atrocities she'd committed. As he finished tightening the bolts, he decided to drop a hint, to see if he could rattle her. "You know, you seem familiar," he said casually, wiping his hands on a cloth he pulled from his pocket. "Maybe I've seen you around before. In the news, perhaps." Agatha's eyes flashed, a brief glimmer of tension that she quickly masked with a smile. "I have one of those faces," she replied smoothly, dismissing his comment with a practiced ease. "Of course," he murmured, though his gaze lingered just long enough to let her know he wasn't convinced. The tension between them was palpable now, each word exchanged like pieces in a chess match, calculated and cautious. Agatha's mind raced, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. She didn't know who this man was, but his demeanor hinted at more than a simple Good Samaritan. Then, the faint sound of sirens began to hum in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Agatha's smile disappeared, her face hardening as she processed the implications. This wasn't an accident. This man hadn't stumbled upon her by chance. She'd been lured, manipulated, cornered. Luggard straightened up, his face now impassive as he met her glare. She could see it in his eyes now. He was no ordinary bidder. He was here with a purpose, and those sirens were no coincidence. The pieces started falling into place, and her mind raced to come up with a way out, a strategy to escape. For the first time in a long time, Agatha felt the cold grip of fear, realizing she had underestimated this man. He wasn't just a stranger. He was her downfall in disguise. In a remote cabin tucked away from the prying eyes of society, Agatha's dark empire continued to churn, relentless and monstrous. Inside, a handful of her henchmen kept watch over a group of young, terrified children who had been trafficked and delivered here, a mere fraction of the vast web Agatha controlled. But today, the air in the cabin was thick with tension, the unease among the men tangible, pressing down like an invisible weight. Marcus, Agatha's most loyal lieutenant, paced the length of the room, his face drawn with a mixture of anger and doubt. He'd been with Agatha since her husband's reign, had seen the transformation in her after his death, and had accepted the lengths she'd go to for power and control. But lately, something was shifting. The shadows of guilt, once easy to ignore, had started to creep in, especially after a young girl, barely 15, had managed to escape the previous night. She hadn't gotten far before a neighbor had found her, injured and desperate, hiding in a ditch. The neighbor, alarmed and horrified, had tried to get her to a hospital, only to hear a story that left him speechless. The girl had recounted, in shaking words, the abuse and violence she had endured under the hands of those who held her captive. By morning, the news of the girl's escape had spread among Agatha's crew like wildfire, unsettling even the most hardened of her men. Marcus, one of the newer recruits, muttered, unable to contain his nervousness any longer. "Are we really doing the right thing? I mean, she's just a kid." Marcus scowled, anger flickering across his face as he shot a hard look at the young recruit. But there was something else there too, a hesitation, a crack in the facade of loyalty he wore like armor. "Right or wrong doesn't matter here," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "This isn't about us. We have a job to do, and Agatha expects us to do it." Another man, older and visibly shaken by the news of the escape, spoke up. "There are whispers that the police are tightening their net. What if this whole operation is about to come crashing down?" Marcus paused, feeling the eyes of the group on him, their doubts and fears mirroring his own. For years, he had believed in Agatha's twisted philosophy, the allure of easy money and power blinding him to the true cost. But the stories from the trafficked kids, the terror in their eyes, these things stayed with him, haunted his quiet moments. The young girl's desperate escape had brought it all to the surface, forcing him to confront the darkness he'd tried to ignore. To regain control, Marcus addressed them coldly, hoping to quell their fears with practical logic. "Look, this is business. Do you think the people at the top of society don't have their hands dirty? We're just a piece of it all, a cog in the machine. There's a demand, and we fill it. The buyers are influential. They protect us. They want this as much as Agatha or anyone else. It's the way of the world." Just then, a distant but growing sound reached them, the unmistakable wail of police sirens. The color drained from Marcus's face. He'd heard rumors, yes, but he'd dismissed them as paranoia. Now, the reality sank in with full force. The law was closing in, and Agatha's empire was starting to crumble around them. One of the men thought, "Is this telepathy?" Meanwhile, back on the desolate highway, Luggard maintained his unflinching calm, keeping Agatha distracted as the sirens grew louder. Agatha had been trying to piece together who this man was, why he'd appeared here and now, why he seemed to know her more intimately than he should. But before she could come to any conclusions, the sound of the sirens finally registered, and the color drained from her face. "You," she hissed, her voice tinged with fury as realization dawned. "You set me up." Luggard merely raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Did you really think you could keep doing what you do without anyone noticing?" he asked, his voice calm and unyielding. "Justice has a way of catching up with people, Agatha. Even those who think they're untouchable." Agatha's eyes narrowed, her mind racing through possible escape routes, calculating her odds. But there was no way out. She was trapped, and the sirens only grew louder, echoing through the barren landscape as a testament to her impending fall. She shot Luggard a look of pure hatred, but he remained unfazed, unmoved by her fury. This was the end she had evaded for so long, finally catching up to her. At that moment, Agatha's world, carefully built on lies, violence, and exploitation, began to crumble. The empire she had fought so hard to maintain, the power she had wielded without mercy, was unraveling before her eyes. And for the first time in her life, Agatha felt the cold, inevitable grip of justice closing in. As the police cars closed in, their flashing lights reflecting off the dark, empty road, Agatha felt her carefully constructed empire slipping through her fingers. Her face betrayed no emotion, but inside, she calculated and recalculated her dwindling options. She cast a sharp glance at Luggard, whose steady gaze and calm demeanor only intensified her frustration. Her fury was palpable, but she knew she had to keep her composure. Just then, a black SUV roared into view, pulling up sharply between her and the approaching police cars. Agatha's lips curled into a small, controlled smile. She recognized that car. Evelyn had been tipped off just in time by one of Agatha's insiders who'd caught wind of the police raid. She dropped everything to rush here, her network scrambling to get her into the heart of the chaos, prepared to do whatever it took to save her daughter. From the driver's side, an older woman stepped out, dressed in crisp designer attire, her silver hair swept back with the same grace and severity that marked her every movement. It was Evelyn, Agatha's mother, and the hidden mastermind, who, even from the shadows, had fueled her daughter's empire with a wealth of resources and connections. Evelyn's presence alone exuded power and influence, a woman so deeply entrenched in the darker sides of society that even whispers of her name instilled fear. Her gaze swept over Agatha with a mixture of pride and exasperation, but when her eyes landed on Luggard, they softened with a hint of recognition. "Evelyn," Luggard murmured, shock flashing in his eyes, his normally calm and controlled exterior momentarily shaken. A flood of memories surged forward, memories he had buried for decades. Evelyn, his mother, the woman who had left him at a foster home when he was 7 years old, never to return. She had vanished from his life without a trace, leaving him to piece together his own survival while she, apparently, had moved on to craft a new family, a new life of privilege and power. Luggard, Evelyn acknowledged coolly, her voice as smooth and practiced as ever. She offered him a brief, evaluating look, as if gauging the man he had become. Her face betrayed nothing, though a flicker of surprise lingered in her eyes. "It's been a long time." "Too long," Luggard replied, his voice laced with the anger he had kept suppressed for years. The shock of recognition faded, replaced by a storm of emotions. He glanced at Agatha, who watched the exchange with a smirk, amused by the tension, sensing the vulnerability in her otherwise impenetrable enemy. Agatha's smirk grew as she took in the scene. "Well, isn't this an interesting family reunion?" she sneered. "Who would have thought my mysterious buyer was my half-brother?" Luggard's jaw tightened. The revelation struck with a force he couldn't ignore. Agatha, the woman he had spent months tracking, whose crimes he had catalogued with cold efficiency, was his own blood. The realization churned within him, stirring both anger and a strange, undeniable kinship. This was the family he never had, the connection he'd craved as a child. But it was twisted and dark, buried under layers of betrayal and cruelty. Evelyn's voice broke through his thoughts. "Luggard, you don't need to involve yourself in this any longer. I can make all of this disappear. You'll be compensated, of course. Walk away, and you won't have to carry the burden of family shame on your conscience." Her tone was persuasive, as though this were merely another business deal, an arrangement to be managed with the right words and the right price. Luggard met her gaze, the pain of abandonment flaring in his eyes. "You left me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, thick with anger. "You left me alone, and now you want me to walk away again. All to protect this." He gestured toward Agatha, who looked unfazed, even amused, at the emotional turmoil playing out between mother and son. Evelyn's face remained a mask, though there was a glint of steel in her eyes. "You don't understand, Luggard. There are priorities, expectations. Agatha has proven herself valuable. She is my legacy, my creation." Luggard felt a surge of betrayal, his heart pounding with a mixture of sorrow and disgust. Here was his mother, ready to sacrifice him once again, this time for the daughter she had chosen over him, the daughter she had molded into a ruthless mastermind. Agatha's smirk returned as she sensed his hesitation, confident that his familial bond would save her. "Face it, Luggard," she taunted. "Family is thicker than law, isn't it?" But something in Luggard hardened. He saw through the false smiles, the cold manipulation, and the family loyalty twisted beyond recognition. He realized then that this family was built on lies, cruelty, and abandonment, and he would not allow himself to be dragged down by it. "Family is supposed to mean something," he said, his voice steady, each word laced with finality. "But not this. You chose this path, Agatha. And you," he glanced at Evelyn, "you left me to fend for myself. I don't owe either of you anything." Agatha's smirk faltered, a brief glimmer of disbelief crossing her face, but Evelyn's gaze turned icy. "You're making a mistake, Luggard," she said quietly, the threat underlying her words unmistakable. "Maybe," he replied, stepping back and nodding to the police officers closing in. "But it's one I can live with." As the officers moved in to arrest Agatha and Evelyn, Luggard stood unmoving, his heart pounding with a strange, bittersweet satisfaction. He had chosen justice over blood, leaving his dark family legacy behind on that desolate highway. As the steel cuffs clicked around Agatha's wrists, she cast a dark, venomous look at Luggard. In her eyes, there was a flicker of betrayal, of anger. This wasn't the way it was supposed to end. She'd built an empire, crafted a life of power and control, and now her own flesh and blood had torn it all down. "They'll never break me," she hissed, her voice low but seething with a furious intensity. "You think you're better than me, Luggard. You're just like her," she spat, jerking her head toward Evelyn. "Turning on family the moment it's convenient, betraying blood to save yourself. You're no different from us." Her words hit Luggard with a force he hadn't expected. She was twisting the concept of family, trying to plant the seeds of guilt and doubt in him. But Luggard's resolve held firm. He'd spent his life wrestling with what family meant, feeling the sting of abandonment, the emptiness of a mother who'd chosen power over her own child. Now, Agatha was trying to use those same sentiments against him, to sway him with a twisted, corrupted vision of loyalty. He met her gaze, his eyes steady and unyielding. "A family built on suffering isn't a family at all," he said quietly, each word measured and final. His voice held no malice, only a resolute certainty. He took a step back, turning his back on Agatha and Evelyn, choosing to walk away from the toxic legacy they represented. In that moment, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders, leaving only a sense of bittersweet liberation. Agatha's face twisted in anger, the realization of her powerlessness dawning fully. She struggled against the officers holding her, but it was too late. The courtroom trial that followed few weeks later became a spectacle. The story of Agatha and Evelyn's trafficking empire splashed across the headlines, drawing public outrage and condemnation. Witnesses and survivors came forward, recounting the horrors they had endured, exposing the depth of the cruelty Agatha had orchestrated. The world saw the true face of the woman who had hidden behind layers of charm and control, and in the end, there was no sympathy left for her. Agatha was sentenced to life in solitary confinement, cut off from the empire she had built and the power she had once wielded. The isolation was a fitting punishment. The very silence and solitude she had inflicted upon her victims now became her own prison. She was left to face the endless days alone, stripped of every semblance of control, every fragment of her former life. Evelyn, too, was charged and sentenced, her wealth and connections unable to shield her from the consequences. Her legacy, once a tale of influence and power, was forever tainted. She faced a lengthy prison term, her name now synonymous with betrayal and corruption, a fallen figure in a twisted saga of greed. Outside the courthouse, Luggard stood for a long moment, breathing in the crisp air, his thoughts tangled but resolute. He had brought justice to people who had suffered in silence, victims who had lived in fear under Agatha's brutal reign. He had stopped his mother's corrupt legacy from spreading further harm. Yet, as he turned away from the courthouse steps, he couldn't ignore the hollow ache that lingered in his heart, the quiet sorrow of severed family ties, even ones as twisted as his own. Luggard knew he had made the right choice, but he also knew it came at a cost. He had chosen duty over blood, justice over loyalty to a family that had left him scared. As he walked away, he felt a sense of purpose, a newfound clarity, and the beginning of healing. He had freed himself from a darkness he'd never asked to be a part of, closing a chapter on a family that had chosen cruelty over compassion. For the first time, Luggard felt at peace, knowing he had reclaimed his life on his terms, a life no longer bound by the shadows of his past. Is it over? Agatha, from her confinement, still wants to push her own justice. What if her car somersaulted and she died due to the nail trap? Is there no other way of getting her arrested? It is not over for her yet. Now, what would you do if you were Luggard? Would you protect family or do the right thing? Is this justice or revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to stay connected as we continue to craft unforgettable stories just for you. Thank you for joining us in this story. We hope it left a lasting impression.